The Glock pressed cold against her jaw. Emily Blaze Carter didn't flinch. She didn't scream, didn't move an inch, nothing. And the man holding the weapon, tall, smirking, thinking he owned the night, paused. He had expected fear, expected panic. Instead, he found stillness, a calm that didn't belong to someone human. His fingers twitched. "Any last words?" he hissed. The words hung in the humid, flickering light of the gas station, dripping with expectation. Blaze's eyes scanned him, sharp and quiet. Every muscle, every tendon, measured. She counted his foot placement, the slight lean in his left shoulder, the tension in his grip. The neon buzz of the sign overhead cast shadows that made him look larger than he was. He was sure he had her cornered. He was wrong, dead wrong. And in that moment, 30 seconds that would echo forever, he realized nothing in his experience had prepared him for this calm. The gas station's interior smelled of burnt coffee, dust, and old asphalt seeping in from outside. A lone clerk ducked behind the counter, frozen. Blaze's boots clicked softly on the cracked linoleum, deliberate, controlled. Her hand hovered over the water bottle she'd picked, just inches from the glass. Not for weapon, not for defense. Observation, analysis, timing. She didn't need to act. Yet. The man's grin faltered, the cock of his head betraying confusion. She had already decided what would happen first, and it wasn't what he expected. He pressed the muzzle up, sharper now, just grazing her chin. His smirk widened, arrogant, drowning caution. "You gonna talk?" he spat. Silence. That was her first weapon. Silence. Eyes locked on his, unwavering, cold. Her breathing even, her stance unshakable. Every instinct screamed at him that he was no longer in control. He felt it, the first ripple of fear crawling up his spine. But she wasn't afraid, she never had been, and that terrified him more than the gun itself ever could. Blaze shifted a fraction, heel to toe, weight recalibrated, micro-adjustments, minor moves that would decide life and death in seconds. She wasn't preparing to dodge, she wasn't panicking, she was drawing him in, making him believe he still had the advantage, letting him expose every weakness. The man's heartbeat picked up audibly in the silent spaces between the hum of the neon sign and the distant drone of passing traffic. He didn't notice the flicker in her eyes, the subtle shift of her shoulders. One misstep, one moment too slow, and he would pay. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Blaze's lips didn't move. Her mind raced, calculating angles, momentum, leverage. She wasn't scared. She was ready. The Glock trembled slightly in his grip as he imagined how easy it would be to end it in a second. But she already knew where his wrist would falter, when his balance would shift, and how fast she would strike. 30 seconds. That was all it took. 30 seconds before everything he thought he controlled would crumble around him. Outside, the night pressed in like a silent witness. The fluorescent lights above flickered, threatening to go out. Somewhere, a car door slammed, far enough not to matter, but close enough to remind him this was real. Blaze's eyes never left him, calm, calculating, deadly. And the moment the Glock wavered just a fraction, the first twist struck. Not from her fear, not from hesitation, but from precision. He didn't even realize what was coming until the air shifted, until the silence screamed louder than any gunshot could. The clerk behind the counter finally exhaled, a tiny whisper lost in the tension. Blaze didn't blink, didn't speak, and in that frozen, charged moment, she made one choice, a single, silent decision that would unravel the man's entire world in the next heartbeat. That was the hook. That was the promise, and anyone watching anywhere across the globe would never forget it. The taller man leaned forward, thinking his shadow could intimidate her. Emily Blaze Carter barely shifted, just a flick of her eyes, a scan. Every muscle in his body betrayed him, slight curl in the right wrist, knees locked, chest jutting like he thought dominance could be forced. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't even let her breathing falter. He had assumed advantage, he had assumed fear, and now, 30 seconds in, he realized both were illusions. Blaze shifted weight subtly, a micro-movement so small it would have been invisible to any civilian, but the shift changed every angle of engagement. The wiry accomplice mirrored his partner, stepping forward slightly, thinking proximity would give them control. But every step, every twitch, every eye movement, Blaze had calculated in milliseconds. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, as if she were choosing a water bottle, not parsing a threat that could end in blood. The faint hum of the neon lights bounced across the linoleum, throwing their distorted shadows over the cracked tiles. She smiled ever so slightly, a ghost of amusement for what would come next. "You don't look scared," the tall man spat. "I said don't move." The wiry one snorted behind him, hands in pockets, trying to look casual. Blaze's head tilted, ever so slightly, exposing the tiniest fraction of her neck, not as vulnerability, but as bait. She didn't flinch, and in that moment her mind traced every possible motion they could make, every weak spot, every miscalculation, timing, angles, force vectors, every single move measured, recorded, stored. She could take them both down before either realized they'd lost. A bead of sweat rolled down the wiry one's temple, unnoticed by Blaze, but cataloged in her mind as instability factor number 3. Her eyes flicked to the rear exit, a potential escape if he tried, and mapped the distance to the door, to the nearest cover, to the nearest civilian. Every inch of the room had been memorized before she even stepped inside. She had walked this gauntlet 1,000 times in drills, simulations, and real-world extractions. Now, 2 armed men were unwitting participants in her silent choreography. The taller man jabbed his finger at her chest. "You think you're clever?" He stepped closer. Blaze's eyes never left his, calm, deliberate, deadly. And then the first flicker of motion. Her hand rose subtly, not to strike, not yet, but to measure his response. The wiry one leaned forward, curiosity over caution. Mistake. A faint twitch in his shoulder betrayed tension. Blaze's mind recorded it. She calculated the exact nanosecond his balance would falter when he committed to a step, the exact angle his wrist would lock if he tried to manipulate her. Every possible reaction stored, every possible counter already running in her mind. Her presence alone began to warp the energy in the room. The men could feel it, though they didn't understand it. Slow, controlled, unblinking. The wiry one tried to smirk, tried to project confidence, but the micro-tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Blaze tilted her head again, subtle enough for anyone not trained to miss entirely. But she wasn't playing for spectacle. She was setting the stage, and the stage was lethal. Seconds ticked in quiet, stretching into eternity. Blaze's mind replayed patterns of previous encounters. The smallest errors were often fatal. Her heel lifted an inch, adjusting balance just enough to gain leverage if either of them lunged. She didn't breathe heavily. She didn't shout. She simply was. And the room became hers, even as the men convinced themselves they still controlled it. The wiry one's hands brushed his waistband. Too flow. Blaze's eyes tracked, body adjusted. One silent micro-step backward, weight shifted onto the right foot, calculated to absorb any sudden movement. The taller man's finger tightened on the Glock. He flexed his wrist, preparing for a snap decision. And that was the second they realized they weren't the hunters. They were prey. Her mind moved at speeds impossible to follow. Every detail, the slide tension, the Glock's angle, the temperature of their skin, the sounds of each shallow breath, compiled into actionable intelligence. She could disarm them in a heartbeat, and yet she didn't. Not yet. She waited. Let them believe control was theirs. Let them believe advantage was real. Because the harder they fought for dominance, the faster she would dismantle it. The taller man's grin faltered. He leaned down, voice low, venom lacing every word. "You better talk, girl." Blaze tilted her head, lips barely parting. "Why? So you feel like a winner?" The wiry one laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Mistake. Their laughter, small but audible, gave her the rhythm she needed to anticipate micro-movements, foot placement, wrist flex, micro-shift in weight. Every second they breathed wrong, every twitch, every misstep she absorbed, every single one. Suddenly, the taller man lunged slightly, just enough to test her reflexes. Blaze adjusted instantly, weight shifting seamlessly from heel to toe, shoulder rotation absorbing the movement. Her hand traced a line through the air, catching the muzzle before it could press harder. She didn't flinch, she didn't scream, and the room went silent. No one breathing, no one moving. Only her, only the calculation, only the inevitable. Time slowed. Each microsecond extended into a canvas of possible outcomes. Blaze calculated leverage, body placements, grip pressure, counter angles. She saw their fear before it registered in their minds. The wiry one's eyes widened, the first honest crack in his composure. And that was the moment, the exact frame where everything tipped in her favor. Not brute force, not speed, but absolute, silent mastery. Her movements remained almost imperceptible, a slight step back, a subtle adjustment in hand angle, a whisper of weight shift. She was invisible in her intent, yet utterly dominant in execution, and the men felt it. The tension was tangible, a living thing that wrapped around their throats. The taller man cursed under his breath. The wiry one stuttered a question that never completed. Blaze didn't respond. She didn't have to. The room itself screamed the answer. They were trapped. The longer they lingered in their arrogance, the more exposed they became. Blaze's mind ran endless simulations of their next moves, every micro-error cataloged. She knew how far they could bend before balance broke, how far they could lean before leverage was lost, and when the tiniest twitch would send them sprawling. Each second reinforced the hard truth. The illusion of control was gone. They were participants in a game they had no chance of winning. A sudden sound, the faint squeak of a shoe on tile, ticked in rhythm with her pulse. She measured it, noted it, calculated distance and momentum. The wiry one's breath hitched. The taller man's hand quivered ever so slightly. Blaze's lips curved, just a fraction, as though amused at the perfection of their exposure. They still thought it was a battle of strength. They didn't understand subtlety, timing, precision, the art of disarming fear without firing a shot. The fluorescent lights above flickered, throwing harsh shadows across the room. Each shadow told a story, each reflection an opportunity. Blaze pivoted lightly, just enough to shift her center of gravity. The Glock remained in his hand, but he was already off balance. She didn't raise a finger, didn't touch the weapon. She simply existed in the exact space that amplified his miscalculations. The wiry one froze, noticing nothing, yet sensing danger. Then the first micro-movement, a small step forward from him, a misjudged advance. Blaze's hand swept in a near-invisible arc, catching the muzzle before it could press harder. She didn't flinch, she didn't scream, and the room went silent. No one breathing, no one moving. Only her, only the calculation, only the inevitable. By now, the men realized too late that the game was over before it began. Every subtle misstep they had made was cataloged and stored. Every twitch was an opportunity exploited. Blaze's silence screamed louder than any gunshot ever could. The wiry one tried to reach, adjust, intervene, but the calculated timing rendered him irrelevant. The taller man's smug grin vanished, replaced with the first genuine glimpse of fear in his adult life. And in that frozen, charged instant, Blaze prepared to strike. The first Glock hit the tile floor with a muted clack, barely audible over the hum of the neon lights. Emily Blaze Carter didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. Her eyes scanned the room like a predator calculating the next strike. Every reflection, every shadow, every twitch of the men still breathing, still thinking they were in control. She crouched slightly, not in fear, but in preparation. The wiry one froze mid-step. The taller man cursed under his breath. And somewhere deep in the gas station's hollow silence, time seemed to stretch.
"You think this is over?" Blaze's voice was calm, almost conversational, but each word landed like a steel hammer. The taller man's smirk faltered. His partner's hand twitched toward a concealed weapon, mistake number one. Blaze's eyes flicked, tracking, calculating. A slight pivot of her shoulders, and the trajectory of the Glock was already compromised. She didn't even reach for it. Her body alone controlled the angle, the leverage, the outcome. The wiry one stumbled back, realizing too late that the room had transformed into a trap, a deadly cage from which there was no escape. And then, from nowhere, a shadow moved across the far aisle. Allie? Stranger? Another threat? Blaze's pulse didn't spike. Her mind cataloged the intrusion instantly. The new figure was tall, masked, hands slightly raised, but subtle signals betrayed tension. Blaze's lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile. Another variable, another complication, and yet still under her control. The men hadn't even registered it yet. Every instinct they had assumed would protect them was failing. Every second of advantage they thought they held was evaporating, replaced by her relentless, silent dominance. The taller man lunged again, reckless now, desperation thick in his movements. Blaze's pivot was seamless, precise, a blur to the untrained eye. She trapped his wrist, guiding it up, twisting just enough to disable leverage. The Glock went spinning, caught midair, locked and secured before it could fire. A faint metallic click resonated through the room, final, absolute. The wiry one tried to intervene, a panicked movement, and Blaze anticipated it, pivoting again, redirecting his momentum to off-balance him. He collided with the shelf, a cascade of chips and cans rattling across the floor. Every microsecond was calculated, each subtle adjustment intentional. Blaze's eyes never left the men, calm, ruthless, unblinking. They had thought control meant guns, threats, and noise, but control was silence, anticipation, timing. The neon sign above flickered, throwing fragmented light across their faces. Fear, confusion, disbelief reflected back at them. Blaze's voice cut through, quiet, measured. "You're going to stay right there." Not a command, not a threat, just fact. And it landed heavier than any punch could. Time slowed. The ally, shadowed figure, shifted slightly, raising a hand in question. Blaze's glance was enough. "Stand down," she whispered, eyes like steel. The figure nodded, an unexpected obstacle neutralized before it had the chance to alter the flow. Meanwhile, the taller man's face had turned pale. He had realized, finally, that everything he had counted on, his aggression, his control, his assumptions, was meaningless. The wiry one's knees trembled. Panic seeped into the gaps of their overconfidence. Every movement they had made, every twitch, every gesture, they had been mapped, recorded, neutralized before it even happened. Blaze's movements were almost imperceptible. A subtle step here, a slight shoulder rotation there. The Glock, now harmlessly locked in her hand, felt heavy with significance. Each second she didn't act amplified their mental collapse. The taller man, desperate, tried a feint, a flinch toward the exit. Mistake. Blaze's pivot anticipated the motion perfectly. He collided with his partner, throwing them both off balance. The wiry one gasped, realizing his own leverage had been systematically dismantled. And all of this happened without a single shot fired. Silence had become a weapon. "You thought you had advantage," Blaze said softly, voice cold, almost conversational. "But you never left my shadow." The words cut sharper than any blade. The men's expressions flickered between rage, terror, and disbelief. She had predicted every variable. Every action they thought was theirs had been part of her design. And in that instant, the room became a theater of psychological domination, her playground. Each second stretched into eternity as the men comprehended, too late, the extent of her control. Outside, distant sirens began to wail faintly, a soft crescendo blending with the humming fluorescent lights. Blaze didn't flinch. The ally moved, silent, handing her additional tactical equipment, a secondary measure, unseen, but perfectly timed. Blaze's gaze swept the room, cataloging the civilians, the clerk frozen behind bulletproof glass, and every minor detail that could affect the outcome. Each small movement was part of a broader calculus, orchestrated, inevitable. The men realized with chilling clarity that the room had been a cage from the very beginning, and they had been blind to it. The taller man, trembling now, tried to speak. You can't." Blaze's hand lifted slightly, not aggressive, just precise, a subtle gesture that cut off his thought mid-word. The wiry one stumbled backward, sweat streaming, realizing that any motion could be fatal. silence had transformed into terror, and in the eyes of the observers, the clerk, the ally, the faint neon light's shadows, Blaze was not just in control, she was untouchable. Every reaction they had assumed would dominate her had been predicted, countered, and nullified. With one fluid motion, she displaced the taller man's balance entirely. His knees hit the floor, weight distributed exactly as she intended, a perfect leverage technique learned in countless simulations. The Glock's slide lock clicked under her thumb, a final, lethal punctuation. The wiry one froze completely, now aware that they were powerless. The ally had shifted to block potential escape routes. Every escape, every bluff, every feint had been neutralized. They had underestimated not just skill, but calculation, preparation, and silent ruthlessness. Blaze's eyes softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. She knelt beside the restrained men, checking the angle of their wrists, confirming immobilization. Every action was precise, methodical, psychological. "Stay there," she whispered, calm, controlled. The taller man groaned. The wiry one whimpered faintly. Neither dared move, neither dare speak. And that was the final psychological hammer. Total, absolute dominance without excess violence. The sirens grew closer. Blaze stood slowly, scanning the neon-lit room, eyes like a predator surveying a territory fully conquered. The ally signaled confirmation, law enforcement en route. Blaze's expression remained unreadable, neutral. The men's fear was complete, crystallized. Their advantage was a mirage, their control an illusion, and every subtle, calculated, ruthless move that had led to this moment was hers. She had won without chaos, without unnecessary bloodshed, without noise, but with an intensity that would linger in the minds of anyone who witnessed it. The deputies arrived, moving cautiously, hands on holsters, eyes sweeping the room. Blaze stepped aside, hands visible, body language relaxed but commanding. The taller man's gaze met hers, filled with disbelief, anger, humiliation. She didn't look back. She had no need to. The psychological victory had been total. Every micro-action, every observed detail, every tactical manipulation had led to here. The men were silent, restrained, their mental collapse complete. Even as evidence was catalogued, weapons secured, and backup cleared the scene, Blaze remained calm, calculating. Her presence dominated even without words. The ally stood back, nodding. The clerk blinked rapidly, trying to process what had just occurred. The room smelled faintly of sweat, fear, and ozone from the Glock's discharged round, a haunting mix that would remain etched in memory. And Blaze, silent, steady, almost ethereal in her precision, walked to the door, water bottle in hand, as if nothing had happened at all. Her final glance at the restrained men, cold and unreadable, was a silent testament. Victory was never about aggression. It was about control, calculation, and perfect execution. The dark twist, the ally, the psychological domination, and the unbroken silence ensured this was not just a fight won, but a lesson carved indelibly into the minds of all who witnessed it. And somewhere, beneath the neon glow and quiet hum, she prepared for the next mission, the next challenge, the next silent triumph.